The Watership Down podcast is intended for listeners who are familiar with the plot. There will be spoilers. This episode is scripted by Newell Fisher, Matthias Ramos and Eric Steps. It is narrated, recorded and edited by Newell Fisher. Hello, and welcome to the Watership Down podcast episode 200. And we begin this week with two messages from listeners. Matthias Ramos from Brazil writes, quote, 200 episodes for a podcast is an enormous milestone. Your voice and dedication have been accompanying me for 4 years. The podcast has been in my Spotify Wrapped and my personal favourite since 2021 when I discovered the pod as soon as finished reading the book and watching the original film. Participating in an episode of this podcast was one of the highlights of my Watership Down experience for me. I made a contribution to episode 69, Religion, Folklore and Seership in Watership Down. I even highlighted it in my Instagram, the happy I was. Thanks for keeping it strong. Sending a sincere and friendly handshake from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. End quote. Thank you, Matthias. Much appreciated. Regular contributor Eric Steps from Germany writes, quote, the Watership Down podcast was a lucky find for me and has become my favourite piece of media to look forward to. Watership Down always being my favourite franchise, it lacks general attention and a fandom is barely existent. So to find a podcast with this much dedication to the details, which not only covered the book, but so far every known adaptation is just awesome. I learned a lot of new stuff about radio plays, broadcasts and hearing opinions from so much other fans. It is just great. The biggest thing the podcast did for me was to finally persuade me into booking a trip to England, I'm from Germany, and visiting the locations in real life. That turned out to be one of the greatest moments of my life. It is very rare that you can see the locations of your favourite book in real life because most just doesn't exist. Watership Down is a rare instance where of a fictional story all locations exist in real life, and I can't describe the joy to wander and explore on the paw prints of Hazel, Fiver, Bigwig and co. I hope that this podcast will still going on for some while and that there will always be aspects of Watership Down that can be discussed, even if from the adaptations only the graphic novel is left. So I can only say for Newell, thank you so much and keep up the good work. To quote an often used proverb, if your podcast would have 100 listeners, I would be one. If your podcast would have 10 listeners, I would be one. And if your podcast would have 1 listener, I would be that 1 listener. End quote. Thank you so much, Eric. And I'm so glad I helped persuade you to take that wonderful trip to the Watership Down landscape. Next, the image for episode 200 consists of the 3 title images that have been used over the last 4 years. The first, featuring a picture of what I think was a North American cottontail rabbit that I found after an image search when I started the podcast, was used for the first 100 episodes. The second, very enigmatic image was one I used AI to create. This was used from episode 100 to episode 149. And the third image, which is an actual photograph of a British wild rabbit, was one I paid a copyright fee to use from episode 150. And this image, which I really like, will continue to be used. For me, this alert-looking rabbit could almost be what Hazel or Fiver would actually look like. Lastly, before we move on to the main subject of this episode, there have recently been several interesting discussions on the Watership Down podcast Honeycomb group on Facebook on the subject of bucks and does digging, including contributions from members who have actually kept rabbits, as well as astronomy in Watership Down, and a lot of information about music and Watership Down from Leah Michaela. If you haven't already, the group is well worth a look. Anyway, let's get down to business. A Guide to the Warren, the Watership Down Podcast Index. When we reached episode 100 in January 2023, the spirit of the episode was quite celebratory as, at that point, there was still a lot of Watership Down-based material that had not yet been covered. I was also frankly amazed that we had reached that number of episodes. On March 15th this year, the podcast turned 4 years old, and the situation now is rather different. I've had to stop the weekly episodes quite a lot sooner than I had expected, and we are now running out of Watership Down related material to cover. So this 200th episode does not feel quite so celebratory. In fact, it feels to me more like a commemoration of what has gone before. So, in that spirit, I've been scouring the last 4 years' episodes over the last 3 months in order to create a resource that is designed to make the huge amount of material available more accessible. This resource is A Guide to the Warren, which you might also call the Watership Down Podcast Index, and its full text will be the only notes for this episode. Of course, the titles of the episodes usually tell you what they are about, but over the course of the last 4 years there have also been many occasions where other subjects have been dealt with, but this secondary content is difficult to find. Until now. The first section of the Guide to the Warren is a detailed listing of all this secondary content divided into subject areas with episode numbers and timestamps included for every clip listed. What has not been included is follow-up discussions in following episodes, as this is far too common to bother listing. So if the subject of an episode particularly interests you, my suggestion is just to check out the barrow keeping sections at the beginning of the 1 or 2 episodes that follow it. This guide is specifically for content that cannot be found so easily. There is a lot of it, and it seems a shame for it to be so difficult to find. And please, if you come across something I have missed, let me know. This is supposed to be an organic document. The second section of the guide is a detailed episode listing, grouped by chronological themes. This seemed less important than section 1, but it was still only right to include it. So then, what are the themes in section 1 of the guide? Well, they begin, unsurprisingly, with the original novel. After listing the introductions to each section of the novel, we move on to broader issues, such as the use of Lapine and its grammar, and the many clips that deal with the infamous lost paragraph. Other subjects covered are Cowslip's Warren, the dough problem, and 2 contributions from Captain Houseler John Ruths on Hazel's vision during the Battle of Watership Down, and Watership Down as an allegory. Moving on to the 1978 film, we deal with the podcast's trial of the film for alleged abuse of geography, the recent change of its UK rating from universal to parental guidance, the recollections of Michelle Price, who played Lucy in the film, the song Bright Eyes, and the film's soundtrack more generally, and the inclusion of the 1978 film in the Watership Down Canon, finishing with last year's BFI re-release. There is another discussion on the Watership Down Canon, looking at Tales from Watership Down. When it comes to the 1999 to 2001 TV series, there is a preview of the series as well as a discussion of its relationship to the role-playing game Bunnies and Burrows. Finally, there are 2 clips on the lost episode Dandelion's Big Story. In looking at the 2 BBC radio plays, the discussion of audio drama and the BBC in context is listed. For the Netflix series, there are sections on Sam Smith's song Fire on Fire, and clarification of the identities of the does in 3 of the podcast episodes covering the miniseries. The final content-specific section is my initial reactions to reading the graphic novel. We then move on to more general themes, starting with the first character study I included of Strawberry way back in episode 18, as well as the obituary for Acorn that was repeated more recently. Leah Michaela's thoughts on Flyeth and Spartina are also included. There is a brief science section dealing with the geology of chalk downland and the black-headed gull, Kihar species. Then we move on almost inevitably to politics, including the use of snare traps, an introduction to Ephrafa and political aspects of the death of Blackavar in the 1978 film. Then we have a discussion of feminism and Watership Down, and an introduction to the British charity the Rabbit Welfare Association and Fund, which was the subject of the podcast's only appeal. Next, I included my ramblings about the Festival of Frith in this section, as I did allow myself to get a bit political about it. And finally, a brief section on the subject of war, defeat and reconciliation, which was recorded on American Independence Day last year. We then move on to sections on locations in the Watership Down landscape, starting with Nuthanger Farm and my reflections on my visit to Watership Down. I then give all the details of Owsler member Eric Stepp's tour of the Watership Down landscape, including one contribution from Laurie Pepper. This is followed by my reflections on my visit to the site of Ephrafa in 2024. And finally, some reflections from a local to the Watership Down landscape who lives in Kingsclear. The next section is on the appeal of Watership Down. First, there are extracts addressing Watership Down as a special interest and the autistic spectrum, followed by the Watership Down aesthetic and my reflections on the interview with Dr. Catherine Lester in episode 121. I will admit this last inclusion does break my rule about not including content from following episodes. This is followed by the representation of rabbits on film and the appeal of Watership Down to members of the military, something John Ruths made me aware of. The next section is on the Watership Down video game, which was explored in some detail thanks to Eric Steps. And the last section is simply on what I have called podcast admin. This addresses my approach to copyright and giving credit to other contributors, the inauguration of the podcast Owsler, analyses of the audience of the podcast over the last 4 years, and the use of both AI and fan art. And the last topic is my review of where the podcast was going after we finished going through the Netflix miniseries. So that is the guide to the Warren. I'm sure it is not complete yet, there is still a lot more digging to be done, but my hope is that it will now serve as a guide to the less accessible parts of the Warren that we have built together over the last 4 years. But what Warren is complete without a few long ears to inhabit it? Particularly those who actively contribute to the digging of that Warren. The Watership Down podcast Owsler. The podcast Owsler was inaugurated in episode 41, way back in December 2021, as a way of thanking all those who helped to contribute towards its creation and acknowledging what they have done. I need to apologise to Matthias Ramos, whose message I read out at the start, and Ronnie M. Worsey, who, as far as I can see, were never inducted into the Owsler after their contributions to episode 69 on religion, folklore and seership in Watership Down. I only realised this when checking back through my records. I must also apologise to Dr. Catherine Lester, who, as far as I can see, was also never offered Owsler membership after her interview in episode 121, after my review of her fascinating book on the 1978 film. So, all that said, the full roll call for all the Owsler is as follows. And my apologies for not giving all the reasons for inclusion, as I've decided this would take too long. The initial inductees in episodes 41 and 42 were Will Fuller, Rick Morris, Maxine Tubb, Sergil Ahad, Jeremy Downing, Amber Ritzy, Rebecca Porter, Andrew Stevens, an anonymous listener, John Ruths, who was also made captain of Owsler, and Natty Plavin, who I had left out of the initial list by mistake. Episode 59, Chris Boyce, Solveig Singleton. Episode 62, Leah Michaela, who is hereby promoted to Captain of Virtual Patrols, and Sean Higgins, who is Guardian of our Australian radio play burrow. Episode 71, Professor David Morley. Episode 78, Jamie Clubb. Episode 80, Nina Pokowski. Episode 85, Peter Strudwick, Peter White. Episode 86, Michelle Grimm. Episode 90, Javier Ramos. Episode 94, Liza. Episode 99, Dr. Roberta Grandi. Episode 100, Liam Wiles. Episode 109, Eric Steps, who was promoted to Captain of Wide Patrols in episode 132. And Rob Stevenson. Episode 110, Laurie Pepper. Episode 117, Kirsty Yates, Amber Belden. Episode 119, Based Pony Jordimario, Dalabar, Fiver Bunny. Episode 120, Samantha Lee, Inika Kalkman. Episode 121, Jen from Oregon. Episode 126, Callum Wolf. Episode 135, Giancomo Luca. Episode 138, Remy Mindent. Episode 149, Debbie Palmer. Episode 166, Grace Liu. Episode 173, Graham Orr. Episode 175, Sam Birdie Animations. Episode 192, Pikachu Cutie. Episode 195, Illumination. Episode 196, Cheapy 2006, Golden Horn 12 Studios GOJ. Episode 197, Mary G, Alicia Painter, Fiver Hreru. Episode 199, John Moore. And finally, episode 200, Matthias Ramos, Ronnie M. Worsey, and Dr. Catherine Lester. Thank you all so much for your contributions over the last 4 years, without which this podcast would not be what it has become. And to everyone else, you, the long ears who inhabit our virtual warren, thank you for listening and making it all worthwhile. The future of the Watership Down podcast is going to be very different from what has gone before. But, as Hazel says at the end of Season 2 of the animated TV series, We go on, Fiver. We go on. Next time, we begin looking at Fiver, the reluctant shaman.